YA will probably be my first love. The reason I like writing it was at a time when I loved books the most. So I enjoy books now, but I can't say that I love books like I used to love when I was a kid.
That was Stacey Horan, local writer and our guest today on Completely Booked. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Gabby. Stacey is an award-winning author of young adult novels including Inland, Sycamore Lane, and the Elixir Vitae adventures. Stacey writes about things that scare her and finds that writing about those things makes them a little less scary for her, and hopefully for her readers as well. When creating her story, she finds inspiration in the places she has lived and the books she loved to read as a kid.
Stacey now lives here in Jacksonville, Florida with her husband and 2 dogs. And just an FYI, if you enjoy this podcast and loved hearing Stacey's journey from corporate lawyer to full-time writer and would like to chat more with Stacey, you'll be able to meet Stacey at Jax Book Fest this year. Jax Book Fest is taking place on February 29th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the main library. And just some quick details about Jax Book Fest. It is a free event, and you'll be able to interact with more than 80 local and national authors, and there will be books from every genre and for every age.
You will also enjoy author presentations and signings. There will be a pop-up bookstore, self-publishing workshop, writing workshops, activities for kids, presentations from Mosh, music, and more. You'll also be able to hear from our wonderful keynote speaker, Brad Meltzer, who's one of Hollywood's 25 most powerful authors. For more info about Jax Book Fest, just head over to our website at jaxpubliclibrary.org. So without further ado, here is our interview with Stacey Horan. All right. Well, thank you so much, Stacey Horan, for joining us. We're so excited to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Stacey Horan, as she said, and I am an author and a podcaster. So I've written 5 young adult novels, and I host and produce a podcast called The Bookshop at the End of the Internet.
And can you tell us a little bit about the novels that you've published?
Sure. So the first novel that I published is called Sycamore Lane, and it's a YA book. It's a ghost story, but the ghost is not actually the scariest thing in the book, is usually what I end up telling young readers. It's a story that involves bullying and sort of figuring out how to trust people and ask for help and things like that. But the story is actually inspired by a house that I lived in. My husband and I moved to New York, and he was working in the city, so we lived just outside the city in Mount Vernon, which is just north of the Bronx. And we moved into this kind of old house. And when we moved in, there was a room upstairs that had been a little boy's room, and one wall was painted with blackboard paint. And on that wall was written Happy Moving Day. So when we moved in, we thought, oh, how nice that they left that up for us. And we didn't think much of it, and left it up for a long time because it was really the last room we unpacked. And I think we moved in the summer. And that Christmas, we went to a holiday party at a neighbor's house, and the prior owners were there. So we told them how much we were liking the house. And we said, hey, by the way, thanks for leaving the note. Happy Moving Day. And they looked at us like we were crazy. And they swore they had not written it. And they didn't think their little boy had written it because it was actually rather high up on the wall. So we kind of laughed it off. I filed it away. And I was trying out a writing exercise one day, like probably a year or 2 later. And I thought, well, okay, I'll just write a short story. What if this house had a ghost, and the ghost decided to leave me little notes on that blackboard wall upstairs? So I started a short story, and it was meant to be maybe 2 pages. And it turned into 20 pages and eventually a whole book. So that was the only book I've ever written just off the cuff, just completely pantsing it, having no idea where it was going. I mean, I certainly didn't know the ending. I didn't even know what was coming next in the paragraph. So it was a lot of fun to write, not very efficient as far as writing a book goes.
So did you ever figure out who wrote that?
No. And the house, as far as I know, wasn't haunted, at least not that I was aware. So I didn't have actual ghosts to contend with while writing it. It was scary enough just writing the story. So I didn't have actual real ghosts stalking me in the house. So that was the first book I published. The second one is called Inland, and it is set in New York City, our New York City, and the New York City of an alternate universe called Inland. And it follows our main character, Kat, and her 2 best friends. And on Kat's 18th birthday, her friends take her out for a night on the town. And they show up in Grand Central in Midtown Manhattan, and they board a train at track 101, and they take the train rolls right back into track 101 at Grand Central in Midtown Manhattan in the alternate universe inland. And the thing to do when you go to this alternate universe is to find your identical. So the you in that universe. The trick is the you in that universe is the opposite of you. So if you are kind and compassionate and laid back, like the main character Kat, your identical is not. So her identical is rather ruthless and doesn't take lightly to being gawked at like a tourist attraction. So she decides to sort of wreak havoc on Kat's life, follows her back to this universe, and really messes with her. And so the story follows Kat having to try and resolve this problem that she created and the decisions she makes, both good and bad, along the way. So that's inland. And then
Sounds really cool.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that concept?
Well, I actually had a dream, which I know sounds a bit cliche for having an idea for a book, but it's true. I had a dream that involved a scene from that book. And at the time, I remember waking up right after having it and just thinking, this is a story. Like this is in a book. It's only part of the story. So I didn't know what had happened up to that point. So the scene that I dreamt that I write in the book takes place in a jazz club. And it's a, dark, small jazz club. And on the stage is this woman with beautiful reddish auburn hair and just beautiful pale skin and wearing a gorgeous emerald green dress. And she's singing. And sort of like a movie, the view kind of pans out. And I see that there's a woman sitting at a table by herself watching the woman on stage. And I realize that the woman sitting at the table is the same person, but her red hair is all pulled back tight in a bun, and she's wearing just black clothing and no makeup and trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, as withdrawn into herself as she can be. And then I woke up, and all I knew was that the woman at the table had sacrificed something to be there to watch this woman sing. And they were the same person. And that's all I knew. So it was enough that it stayed with me for actually a couple of years, that idea rolling around in my head. And I finally started to figure out what the story was. Eventually, it just kind of started revealing itself to me, and I knew where it fit in the story. So when I started writing, I had an idea of how the story began and how we got to that point, and I didn't know anything past that. So I did a little bit of plotting, but I had to pants sort of the second half of the book, or really the last 3/4 of the book. But that's how that one came about. And my husband and I went into New York City a lot. I mean, it was 20-minute train ride or something like that to get into the city. And there is a track 101 in Grand Central that is unused. So it's off by itself. It's not lined up with all the other tracks. It's kind of in a weird place. And it's got a gate in front of it, and it's dark and now just isn't used. And when I was looking for a way to get to the alternate universe, I was like, well, why don't we just put it in one of the busiest places in the world? We'll just make it happen right here in Grand Central. And I'll just use that vacant track that's never being used. So who's gonna know?
Love it. That is so cool.
And you were practicing law when you first began writing your first book. How did that shift come about?
So desperation, basically. I do a lot of school visits, and they always ask, like, why did you start writing? And my answer is always sheer boredom. That's why I started writing. So I practiced law for just shy of 20 years. But I started writing probably about 7 years into my career, because at that point I was doing corporate law, basically. That's what I did. And I worked for a firm for about half a dozen years, and then I went in-house. So it was mostly corporate law, some contract law. And it was sitting at a desk, staring at the four walls of my office. Most of what I did was over the phone. So I worked with people all over the world, but on the phone. I wasn't visiting these places. I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't taking vacations because there was just way too much work to be done. And there was no time for any hobbies or creative outlets. And I was desperate for something creative. And I'm pretty much a realist. So I know that I am not musically inclined in any way at all. And stick figures are about the extent of my actual artistic ability. And even they're questionable. So I needed something that I could do in small moments. So I started just writing stories, and it was kind of after work, a little bit before bed, or maybe on the weekend if I had, half an hour free. And a lot of times it was 5 or 10 minutes while I was eating lunch at my desk in between conference calls and meetings and document reviews. So it was just a way for me to escape the office and do something exciting, even if it really was just for 5 minutes. And eventually I struck upon a story, and I focused my energy on that story. So that story was written sort of in 5-minute increments and took about 12 years to complete. So it just gave me something to do. So that's how I started writing. I had never really written before that. I mean, I was good at writing in school, but had never considered it as something to actually do.
So you're basically self-taught. Besides like the regular stuff you learn in school.
Right. I remember going through school and loving books, and never, ever thinking, I should write one, or I'd like to do that. I don't know how I thought they got written. Just authors were just magical elves, maybe, creating books, and they weren't real people. It wasn't really something that I would ever be able to do. So I never considered it. And it wasn't until I needed that outlet. And I thought, well, I can do that sitting at my desk. Nobody's going to know. And nobody ever has to read what I write. So nobody has to know that I'm doing this, but it'll sort of feed that part of my soul that was being, left unattended, let's say.
So, and then you decided to leave law entirely?
Yeah. So, an opportunity came about. The company I worked for, I had worked for a global company, and my husband and I had lived overseas for about 5 years. We lived in England and worked for the parent company. And he had a job opportunity after that 5 years to move to New York. So that's what brought us to New York and the not so haunted house. So I had continued to work for them from the States. So I was working from home, doing the same kind of work and international conference calls and all that kind of stuff. No one knew I was just sitting in my shorts in Florida and having negotiations. So, but the company started changing, and they were rolling out a number of different reorganizations for the way they handled their operations and their sales and their accounting and their legal matters. And so I was sort of shifted around. All the lawyers were sort of shifted around. And it became really hard, I thought, to do the kind of work that I liked doing. And it was maybe more efficient for the company that way, but it wasn't a structure that I was thrilled with. So it got to the point where I was just really frustrated. And then there were some family issues that were requiring my attention, and it was getting a little precarious. So I decided that maybe it was just time. Maybe I had gotten everything I could out of practicing law, and maybe it was time to just kind of retire from it, just stop doing it. So I did, and timing worked out fine because the family issues became worse at that point, and people needed my help and some caregiving and things like that. So it worked out timing-wise. And at that point, I just focused my energy on writing. And a little over a year ago, I added the podcast. So it keeps me busy.
I would say that 5 books later, it seems like you're doing pretty well. And
yeah. And we've only touched on 2 books. So let's talk about your other 3.
Sure. So the other 3 are part of a series. It's called the Elixir Vitae Adventure Series, and it's written for just a slightly younger YA audience. The other 2, the Inland is definitely an older YA audience because of some of the subject matter. Sycamore Lane sits nicely in between. It's been read by kids in middle school, high school, adults. So that one is safe for either. And then I wrote the adventure series with the idea that younger kids could read it and then follow it along. So that series follows a brother-sister team, Abigail and Quinn, and they go to live with their grandfather, and their grandfather's a professor at an elite university, and he enrolls them in a boarding school across the street from the university. And they have to adjust to this new life And these kids have never been anywhere. So they've led quite sheltered lives. They've never traveled. They've never gone anywhere, never had adventures. And they come to learn some things about their grandfather. Not the least of which is that he and a couple of his friends are charged with safeguarding the Elixir Vitae, which is that sort of elusive mythical substance that's supposed to grant immortality. The elixir of life, the fountain of youth, the philosopher's stone, those things. Well, apparently it exists and it's hidden. So he and his friends are supposed to safeguard it, but they don't know where it is because predecessors hid it, and all they have to go on is a clue. And so things start happening in the book, and it becomes imperative that they try and find it. So they have to follow these clues. And so the first book is called Ortus, which in Latin means birth. And they follow these clues around the United States. They go to the Everglades, they go to Hawaii. And the second book follows them on. So they get a year older in school. They have a little more responsibility. They get a little more comfortable with themselves. And, as kids, they have all the same issues that we all had when we were that age. But they're also still having to go on these adventures and keep it all secret. So in the second book, Juvenus is, which means childhood or youth. They go to Europe. And in the third book, Adultus, which means adulthood, they go to Africa. And so the fourth book that I'm close to finishing is Senectus, which means old age. And then the fifth one will be, and they'll go to South America in that one. And in the fifth book, they go to Asia, and that one's called Mortem, which means death. So they follow the cycle of life while they're searching for the Elixir Vitae.
So cool. And why do you choose to write YA novels?
Well, I started, it was quite by accident, that first story that I kind of stumbled upon. It just happened to involve a girl. And I think the reason I like writing it, well, there's a number of reasons I like writing it, but it was at a time when I loved books the most. So I enjoy books now, and I feel strongly about books, and I come to really like books, but I can't say that I love books like I used to love when I was a kid. So I thought, if I'm going to write something, I'm going to spend this time, 12 years or whatever, writing stories that maybe nobody's going to read. I want it to be at least the kind of story I would have just loved, something I would have really been excited to read. So I think that's why I started. I don't know that I'll always write YA. I mean, I think I'll always write YA, but I have story ideas for adult books too. So they're coming, but I think YA will probably be my first love, I think.
Yeah, that's such a good reason, because I think everybody can remember, and for every generation it's different, but like the YA series that came out that everybody just binged, and you remember your first book that you just read front to back and like couldn't put it down for weeks.
Right.
And I feel like that age, is that age is a tender age. So for books to, lead them in the right direction and help them out, with their emotional problems and growing up, I feel like that is just a great spot to be a writer in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we all, if you are lucky enough to attain a certain age, then you are either experiencing those problems or you have experienced those problems. So I've met a lot of adults who like reading YA because I think YA tends to cut out some of the more adult themes in books. And if people just want good stories, and they all can all relate to what's happening in a YA book, because we've all been there. Mm-hmm. We've all been awkward teenagers, and we've all dealt with stuff and we've all at some point thought the world was coming to an end because something that now we think is just small was happening to us. So it's experiences we all have, and it's, some of the themes are just universal. And so, and I think kids are just more passionate about books at that age. Things mean more when they read them. I mean, as adults, we get quite jaded and we focus on just life in general, and there are other things that are taking our attention away. But as a kid, you can focus wholeheartedly on a story.
Totally.
And in a lot of your author bios, you've said that you write about things that scare you in an attempt to make them less scary. When did you figure out that writing about your fears was kind of a cathartic exercise for you?
Not until I had actually written them. So it wasn't until I sort of reflected on, was there a theme to the books I was writing? And why was I writing the kinds of things I was writing? Because when I started, it was just, that was a new, bright, shiny idea. And it was the brightest, shiniest idea at the moment. And so I will write that one. So in trying to understand what I was writing and why I was writing, I realized that a lot of the things I wrote about were things that scared me. And I use that word scared in sort of a very broad, sweeping connotation. So it means ideas that maybe unsettle me, or things I might worry about, or straight up fears. So writing about a ghost, well, straight up fear. I mean, I don't really like the idea of ghosts haunting my house. And that would be something like, if I had to deal with that, what would that be like? And so thinking about things like that, or alternate universes, again, kind of an unsettling idea, really, when you think about it. And the idea of the identicals, the persona we display to others is not necessarily the whole of us. You know, there are things that we hide, or things that we aren't proud of, or things we worry that people will judge harshly if they only knew, or things that we wish we had in our personalities that we don't. So things like that, I can't say they keep me up at night, but there are certainly things that I've thought about or worried about or whatever. So writing about them and spending time with them and having to think about them and having to figure out how someone else would deal with them. Maybe not me, because not all the characters are me, but how would someone deal with these things that are, problematic at best and wholly terrifying at worst. And so I think it helps. It has not yet made anything just not be scary. Like, still scared of ghosts. So I still don't know what I'd do if I had one, but at least in spending time thinking about it, it takes the edge off a bit, let's say.
Right. Can we talk book covers? Because your Elixir Vitae adventures have beautiful book covers. How did you go about choosing the book covers?
Right. Well, I had help. So I found an excellent cover artist. And she was actually a recommendation. A friend of mine, local author, has a great book. Her name's Evelyn Holong, and one of her books is just really sweet, like covers just adorable. And so I asked her who did it, and she put me in touch with this woman, Jenny at Seedlings Design, and she's awesome. And so I approached her. She did Inland for me. That was the first cover we did. And I didn't know what the process was. So I told her a bit about my book, and I said, look, this is what I'm looking for. It's, kind of light and dark and good and bad, and it's set in New York City. Does that help? And so she's like, yeah, sure, I got this. So she sent me proofs and ideas and design ideas, and I kind of picked some, but I had a really hard time. It's just the artistic part is not my strong suit. So I said, I don't know. And as far as colors go, everything, I just don't know. And so she put that cover together and sent it to me, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's really cool, way cooler than anything I could have come up with. So when it came time for the Elixir Vitae Adventures, I told her I wanted something that we could use the same sort of design across the whole of the series. But I would like a design where I could kind of place in it different design elements that represent that book, and we could change them out for the different books. So on the first book, Ortis, there are little pineapples because that represents some place that they go. And so she tweaked it. And so each of the book covers, it's the same kind of general design, but she played with the colors and the actual little design elements and changed up the compasses and the keys and all of that stuff. And it was better than anything I would have come up with. It was great because I just told her generally what I needed. And
yeah, it's fantastic because it's definitely like a book cover that I would pick up. I mean, it looks like a book you could go on an adventure and get lost in.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's just beautiful. And I would pick it up and then, you read the inside and you find out, oh, it's an adventure series. And yeah, she did a good job.
Yeah. No, I'm really pleased. And she's gotten really busy since doing my covers. So I'm hoping she'll finish out the last two, and then I probably will have to wait in line for any other books that I want her to design.
And how was the overall publishing process for you?
Yeah, it was probably typical, I guess. But for me, I struggled with it. It was personally something that was really difficult. So Ortis was actually the first book that I had finished. And I it went through a number of different edits. And the book that's out now is not necessarily the book that I started with, but I had sent that out to agents, and I didn't query a lot of them because I just didn't quite understand the process. So I picked some and I sent it out, and I got rejections back. And I was really struggling with what it meant and how to resolve it and what to do with really a lack of feedback and information. And it was, if you got an actual email or letter, it was, thank you very much, but no, best of luck. And, it was a lot more than that. I think one or two gave me a little bit more feedback, but that was about it. And the one I really love is, the agents or the editors, whatever, that say, if you don't hear from us in 3 months or 6 months, you can consider it a no. And that was a really hard thing for me to deal with because I was still working as a lawyer at the time. And in that world, everything was urgent. I mean, there was no sitting on something and waiting and taking your time with it. So I was in-house counsel, and if something hit my desk, it meant one of two things. Either there was going to be a problem, or there already was a problem, and it needed to be addressed immediately. And so I was behind before I started, and I was late before I'd even begun. And that was the world that I was living in all day, every day. And then to try and sort of exist also in the publishing world where I think I had sent out the second book, which was Sycamore Lane, and I was starting to get responses back from that one. And all of a sudden, I get an envelope one day, and I open it up, and there's a letter and a few pages of a manuscript that I had sent out, like actual hard copy. And the letter was very nice, wishing me luck, et cetera, but turning it down. And I realized it was from the first book I had ever sent out. Like a year or more later, I was getting it in the mail. And that was really a tipping point for me. And I thought, I personally can't do this and be happy with continuing to seek publication. So I had to really decide what I wanted. I knew I just wanted to keep writing stories. And for me, it was really hard to move on to the next project without closing out the one prior. So, for example, it was really hard to finish off Sycamore Lane and get it ready to go out because I hadn't done anything with the first book. Like it was just sitting there. I was still trying to do it. I couldn't move on. And then I couldn't start writing another story until I had resolved like these open-ended books here. I just didn't know what to do. And so I decided that I would, at that point, indie publishing had become big. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll just try and publish one. That way it's done. And for my own satisfaction, I can move on because my fear was I knew I wanted to write stories. I mean, I just wanted to write stories. And ideally someone would read them, but I just needed to write them. And my fear was that I would stop. I would either stall and it would take forever to get another book done, or I'd quit. And that was a genuine fear. And I just was disheartened by the process. So I decided in order to continue, I'd have to take it upon myself to get the books out. So I went the indie publishing route. And what I learned from doing that, so that was a huge learning curve. And what I learned was there is a big responsibility if you go the indie route to basically become the general contractor for your book. I mean, it's the onus is on you to produce a good quality book that people will want to pick up and read, because you want the readers to have an enjoyable experience. So you want the book you want it to look good. It needs to feel good in their hands. It needs to read cleanly, and it needs to be sharp, and it needs to just be well edited. And so there's a responsibility in putting that out there that I think in traditional publishing, others share with you, but it's mostly on you if you indie publish. So I accepted that and decided to go that route. And it allowed me to move on to the other projects and to keep writing. So I'm happy with making that decision. And I understand that's not everybody's decision, but for me, the most important thing was personally being able just to continue writing and not just lose heart and stop.
Yeah. And so, what is your writing process like? Like you've talked about how you've had a dream and then you sat with it for a while and somebody wrote on the blackboard and you sat with that for a while. Like what is your actual writing process like?
Well, it's a lot of getting an idea and then waiting a couple years and then finally sitting down to write it. So story ideas come from everywhere. I mean, there's just a constant bombardment of story ideas, but I usually don't get too excited about them until I realize that they've stuck with me. So the ones that I've written are the ones that have really stuck with me and I just can't shake. And they start taking root and flowering. And I realize, okay, then now it's time to write these stories. So the inspiration is everywhere, but figuring out the ones that really have legs, that takes a while. So once I have an idea, writing for me is actually a pretty scary process. So one of the reasons I think I write about things that scare me or bother me is because the actual act of writing is scary for me. I kind of equated the physical starting to write. So every day when I sit down at the computer and I go to write the first words of the day, that experience is kind of like a cliff dive. It is truly scary. But I have found that I just have to deal with it because once I get past that, then it's fun. Then it's just great fun after that. But doing that initial dive into the story is frightening sometimes. And if I'm writing something particularly dark or a scene that day that's going to be really scary, it's even harder for me to make that initial jump. So I've discovered if I write in the morning early, before I'm fully awake and the coffee has kicked in, then that dive is just kind of a little jump, like a little jump into the wading pool. It's not a big deal. So like 5 a.m, it's easy. Trying to do it in the afternoon, terrifying. So for me, it's all about timing and getting past that initial. I mean, I've had days, like, for example, writing Sycamore Lane, there were a couple times when I wasn't quite sure what was coming, but I knew that day was going to be bad. I knew it was going to be a scary scene I was going to have to write, not knowing exactly what was coming. And there'd be days I just walk away from the computer thinking, I'm just not brave enough today to do it, to sit down and start writing those first words. So it's something I've had to get over, but it's probably not normal, maybe. It's probably not something most writers suffer from, but it's an affliction I have, and I don't know that it's ever going to go away, but I'm making peace with it the more I write. So maybe in 10 books, it'll be easier, and 20 books, it won't be any big deal. I don't know. Hopefully.
And you said that you're working on book 4 and book 5. How do you keep timelines and characters, like all together, knowing that you're working on multiple different timelines and different characters?
So, for the first book, I didn't do anything. I just wrote it. And then for the second book, I found I was writing and flipping through the first book to try and remember what I had written. So, for me, I use Scrivener. I don't use Scrivener to actually write the story, but I use Scrivener as sort of the hold-all, the database for all of the info. So anytime there's a new character, anytime there's a new detail, so the description of buildings, the description of locations, the description of clothing, everything, preferences for food or whatever, I include that in Scrivener under either the character's name or the location or the book, or I dump all those details in there. And inevitably I'll be writing in another book and stop and say, I can't remember whether this character liked this or that. I can't remember if this character says this word very often. So having that as a lot of people use notebooks or whatever, but I found putting it into Scrivener was an easy way to do it.
And can you describe what Scrivener is?
So it's some software. It's a writing package, and you can actually write your books in Scrivener. It sets things up nicely for you. But the way I use it, I create different pages or characters or files for all of these different things. And when you open it up, they're all right there. So it's easy to click on it and see the exact details and all the riddles that I've used for the adventure books and all that kind of stuff. So it's easy to use. It's really easy to use. I find just writing the stories in Word to be better because the guy I get to do the interior design on the the book for the adventure books, we use a certain formatting, and it's just much, much easier if I do it straight in Word. So I've taken to writing in Word, but storing all of the knowledge in Scrivener.
Cool. Very cool. So let's talk about your podcast. It's called The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, which I love that name. And it's a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. How did this project come about?
So maybe about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was having a conversation with my husband, and I was saying, I need to do more social media stuff, and I'm terrible at it. I don't post about myself. I never think to post about myself, what's happening, what's going on, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing. I just live life. I don't actually stop to think, I should document this. So I post very little, and I have to make a conscious effort to do it. And I know as a writer and trying to get your books out there and trying to gain some traction, that you need to do more of that stuff. So I was trying to figure out, how can I do something that would feel authentic for me and not forced or trivial. So I just needed it to feel right in order to be able to do it, because I'm not very good at it. It doesn't come naturally. So I've dragged my husband to enough book festivals now that when I mentioned the idea, he understood what I was trying to say. So I said, what if we tried to create a podcast where it would be like going to a book festival and sitting in an author talk, or going to a bookshop for a signing and listening to the author being interviewed, and where they just kind of have a conversation about who they are and what they write, much like this. And I could be the host, and I could ask the questions, and I could put it out there, and I could get writers that I know to be the guests. And he's like, I actually think that's a pretty good idea, because every book festival I've ever gone to, I end up leaving there with new books and a long list of to-be-reads, because I have sat and listened to the author, and I understand now what he is doing with his stories, or what her background is, or some funny anecdotes that made me sort of have a connection with the author. And that's probably my favorite way of finding new books. So I had to do a lot of research, because I knew absolutely nothing about podcasting, nothing. And at some point, I had to make the decision, okay, I'm just going to have to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to research it forever. So I begged several friends of mine who I had met here at local authors to be my first, 4 or 5 guests. So the first 4 or 5 episodes are not nearly as polished as number 50, which was just put out. But I have to say, I learn a lot with every interview. I usually learn something from every author that I interview. And it's nice to meet authors that way. And it's nice to just sit and talk about books and the writing process and what inspires them to write. And I've learned that people come to writing for all different reasons. Kind of like me, I just was boredom. Some people know early on that they're born to write, that they will be an author, and others stumble upon it later in life. And so everybody's journey is unique. But what I've discovered is, universally, they all continue writing because they have stories to tell. So regardless of the genre, so romance or historical fiction or self-help or cookbooks, whatever it is, they all have stories to tell. And so that's what keeps them writing. And that is a common theme. Everybody's journey is different, and everybody approaches it differently, and everybody's thoughts on writing are different, and marketing and all that stuff, all different. But they all continue to write because they continue to have stories, and they just need to get them down, and they want to share them with people. So the podcast is meant as a way for people to find authors they wouldn't otherwise find, like going to a book festival or going to a bookstore and hearing an author and learning about their book. So that was the whole idea behind the podcast. And my husband actually came up with the name. He's a Douglas Adams fan. And he said, why don't you name it after the restaurant at the end of the universe in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? You could call it the bookshop at the end of the internet. And I thought, well, I cannot possibly do better than that. So that's what it is.
Very cool. And do you find it hard to do full-time podcasting and full-time writing? Like, do you ever go through creative dry spells, or are you kind of doing what you love and it kind of comes easy to you at this point?
Well, I would say it doesn't come easy because there's a steep learning curve for both still. And the biggest challenge is time management. And that's all on me. That's not anything on anybody else. But I like them both and I find them complementary. So doing the podcast usually inspires me to try and find more time to get back to my own writing. And I tend to learn things, which has helped with my own writing. It's helped in sort of understanding the business of writing and what other authors go through and things that they've learned. So I find it helpful. It doesn't detract, certainly, from my own writing, except that it is time consuming at times. I mean, there are some weeks where it's a lot of interviews and a lot of editing, and most of my time is spent on the podcast and less on my own writing. So it's a challenge to find a balance between the two, but I'm committed to both. So I just decide I will make it work, however that shakes out.
And how many episodes is it like a weekly episode or?
Yes, it's a weekly episode. It comes out usually on Wednesdays, unless there's a holiday on the Wednesday, and then probably on the Monday or the Friday of that week. So, and I think, we have over 50 episodes now.
Cool. And do you have any advice for aspiring writers that are like in your situation where you're in a job and you just have the calling for writing?
Right. Yes. So I don't know what's good advice for them because it's a tricky situation. You want to spend more time writing, but the job and life call you away a lot. I would say to just keep writing. For me, it was important to make a decision early on that I really wanted to write. So I remember my husband and I when we were living in England. Early on, when we were there, we were talking about whether or not I should study for and sit for the solicitor's exam. Because I thought, well, I'm in a foreign country and I'm working for this company. And I was on a visa that would allow me to stay if for some reason the company got sold and I was suddenly out of a job or something like that. So I was trying to kind of find some insurance. Like, what should I do? Should I become an English solicitor? So if we're still here, then I could find a job somewhere maybe. Or I was trying to decide what to do and where to focus my energies. And I said, but I kind of want to just finish this book that I've been writing. And he said, well, what do you want more? I'm like, well, I definitely want to finish the book. I mean, I can't say that I really want to study for and take a solicitor's exam. I mean, I already took the bar exam once. I don't relish the idea of doing it again. So he said, well, just finish the book. Just spend your time doing that because you just never know what's going to happen. And that was years ago. So I did, and it took forever. But I made the decision that that's what I really wanted. And so decisions from then on, I try and keep in line with that central theme. I just want to write stories. And so what I do, I try and do in line with that goal.
Your husband sounds like a very fantastic person.
Very wise man.
And very supportive of all your ambitions. Do you bounce all your ideas, like book ideas off him? Is he like a sounding board? Or?
He's great. Yes, he's great. And he is really good at initial ideas. And so sometimes once an idea has germinated and I think it's worth spending some time on, I'll usually run it by him. Sometimes his initial reaction is, I'm not sure about that. But occasionally, he's like, oh, I think that's a really good one. That sounds really interesting. But he's also really good once the book is done at reading it and finding kind of holes in the plot or coming back and asking questions like, I thought the characters were going to do this, but instead you had them do that and I didn't understand why. Or, I had questions about, would they really do something like this? Or wouldn't they say this instead? Or he's really good just finding sort of where the gaps are, or where the weaknesses are in the story. So, he doesn't want to proofread it. Like, he doesn't want to spend the time looking at those details. And I completely understand that. I'm not a fan of the editing process, but he is really good for seeing a big picture and getting the feel for a book and trying to understand what I want to convey in the story. So he's incredibly helpful. He should probably be a writer himself.
Sounds like a great resource. So will you be at Jax Book Fest this year?
Yes, that's the plan. Yeah.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of your all-time favorite books, and what are you currently reading?
Right. So all-time favorite books, they tend to be books from when I was a kid, honestly. I remember my very first favorite book was The Story of Ferdinand. I didn't even know how old I could possibly be. I mean, before I was reading, clearly, but I remember being passionate about that book, loving that book. In fact, I had a little stuffed donkey that I named Ferdinand. Didn't look anything like the bull, but I loved it so much that that was the only story I wanted to hear. And then I remember reading Nancy Drew. Mm-hmm. And I remember being devastated the day I realized I had read all the Nancy Drew books in the library. It was one summer, and I don't even remember how old I was, young. And I remember finally getting to the end and realizing that they just weren't any more Nancy Drew books. What was I going to do? That was a very sad day. And I remember falling in love with Ballet Shoes by Noel Streatfeild. I think that's his name. And just loving that story, the story of three sisters. And I just thought it was great. And so those are the kind of books I remember as like favorite books because they just felt strongly about them. But as far as reading now that I'm an adult, I can't say that I feel as passionately about any book as I did when I was a kid. But I tend to like books because they might come along at just the right time and just the right place. So the one I always think about is Notes from a Small Island by Bill Bryson. So I read that when I was living in England with my husband. And Bill Bryson goes on a long walk through the footpaths of Great Britain. And he was talking about places that we had been and experiences that we had had and thoughts that we had had. And so it just really struck a chord as I was reading it because he's American and his experiences were not dissimilar from our experiences living over there. And I was finishing the book on a flight coming back from someplace into England and into Heathrow. And I remember being on the plane and I got to the point where he is in a pub in Glasgow and he writes out phonetically what the Scottish language sounds like to him. And I'm on the plane and I'm reading this and I started laughing so hard, but I'm trying to keep it in because I'm on a plane and it's evening and people are trying to sleep and I can't just belly laugh on this little plane. And so I'm trying to keep it in and there are tears running down my face and I am shaking violently because I am laughing so hard. And all I could just feel the man sitting next to me leaning away from me, like trying to lean as far away from me as possible, because I'm pretty sure he thought I was having a fit of some sort. But that book just came along at the right time, and it was just the right book to read in that place and in that moment. And so that will always be a favorite because it just was sort of the perfect book for that time.
Absolutely. And is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about your future projects, anything you have coming up?
So I'm hoping that books 4 and 5 of the series will be out next year, 2020. And I will say that the Jacksonville Public Library has been really, really generous. I have approached them several times to do author panels. And so we did one last year, a young adult panel, and we had 3 local authors from the area talk about their books. And we had Evelyn Holong, which I mentioned earlier, R.L. McDaniel, and L. Class. And they talked about their YA books and writing for younger readers and their experiences. And it was great. And so this year, I'm working with the Jax Library again. And I think we have plans for 2 more author talks this spring. So at this moment, we have a children's book author panel that we're slating for, I think, May 16th. And that'll be, I think at this point, 4 or 5 authors from the area. So we've got Sophia Goals and Cindy Hadley Godot and Jane Quackenbush and Heather Macht. So, and I think there's a 5th one. I'm just waiting for confirmation. So they're going to talk about children's books and writing for children. And so it's designed for an audience who is interested in children's books. So if you have a child and you want to learn about local authors who do this, then this is for you. Also, if you're interested in writing children's books, this is probably a good one to show up to because these are authors who are doing that currently and they have them published. So the other panel I think is now going to be slated for April 25th, and it's going to be Southern fiction. So these are writers who have written stories from different genres, but they set their stories in the South, usually small towns in the South. And the setting is crucial to the story. So it's a character unto itself. And in that one, we have Gracie Chandler and Kay Du Shostak. And I think Sue Chamberlain Frederick is going to join us too. And I'm waiting on confirmation for one or two more. So thank you to the Jax Library for working with me to set those up. And again, giving authors, lesser known authors at this point, an opportunity to get their books out and talk to potential readers. So I appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. And we're looking forward to Book Fest as well in February.
Yeah. Super fun event.
Yeah.
You've participated event. in the past, correct?
Yeah. It's an amazing event. It's really, really well done. I mean, it's so easy from an author's perspective. It is wonderful. I mean, it's easy to navigate and it's easy to understand what we're doing and when we're doing it and where to show up and how it works. And there's so many authors that come, and not just from the immediate Jacksonville area. I mean, the draw is quite wide. So it's a nice mix of authors. And for anybody who hasn't been to the Jax Book Fest, they should.
Agreed.
Well, thank you so much, Stacey. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to Completely Booked this week. We hope you enjoyed hearing Stacey's journey from corporate lawyer to award-winning young adult author. To learn more about Stacey, be sure to check out our website, staceyhoran.com. And additionally, if you want to meet her, and believe me, you do, be sure to stop by Jax Book Fest at the main library on Saturday, February 29th. Stacey is also facilitating 2 author panels for the library, and you can find her at Southeast Regional Library on April 25th at 1 p.m. and at Pablo Creek Regional Library on May 16th at 1 p.m.
For more information about Jax Book Fest, be sure to check out our website at jaxpubliclibrary.org, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Jax Library for updates on future podcasts and all library happenings.
Until next time, I'm Amanda.
And I'm Gabby. Bye guys.